So thank you very much, Karen, for that. Welcome to Wrexham. We now have our next keynote speaker, and it's a pleasure for me, a real pleasure, to introduce Professor Graham Donaldson, who will be speaking to us on the values imperative. Now, there will be some time at the end of his talk for questions, so please do take this opportunity to think of whatever it is you want to ask Professor Donaldson. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, and Borada. Good morning, everyone. It really is a genuine pleasure to be here with you at this time. I think there never has been a more important time for us to explore the themes that are in today's conference. And I think the strapline is particularly relevant at this point in time. Creativity, connection, and confidence. And if I think about RVE, I think again, it has never been more important for us to understand just exactly how all of what falls under that very broad term can be integrated into not just a compartment in the curriculum, but across the curriculum. And that's partly what I want to get a chance to talk to you about today. I want to do two or three things. I want to say a little bit about the context that we're currently within, and why, therefore, I think that the issue of values and ethics and religion is just so important in terms of the world that our young people are living in just now, and the world in which they will be our future leaders. They're the ones who will shape the nature of the world to come. And the contribution that we can make as educators during the relatively short time that we have those young people in school can and should have a critical effect in terms of the nature of that society which they will shape and the world that they will live in. So I want to say a bit about context. I then want to talk a bit about just how different Curriculum for Wales is from what has gone before. And that key difference lies on the fact it's a curriculum that builds from 4 clear purposes. So it's not a curriculum. People often think about curriculum as a kind of way of organising content, deciding how much of this, how much of that young people ought to have in the course of their time at school. But curriculum is much broader than that. And the critical thing about Curriculum for Wales is it builds from purpose. It asks those questions, the why questions first of all, before it then moves on to determine how we can best put those purposes into practice. I want to start with a quote, and perhaps surprisingly, a quote from the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. One of the few benefits of lockdown was that it certainly gave me a chance to read things that I probably wouldn't normally have read. And he produced a book called Values, which is, in general terms, looking at the market economy and the risk to values that comes from an untrammeled market economy. And the quote on the screen is really interesting for somebody with his background. Does the narrowness of our vision, the poverty of our perspective, mean that we undervalue what matters to our collective well-being? I think if we said that quote was about education, what's been happening in our schools over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, it has some resonance. The drive, understandable drive, but the drive which we've had at a political level to be increasingly effective in terms of a rather narrow set of outcomes may have produced the kind of effects which Mark Carney talks about in terms of economics. It's narrowed our vision. We can lose a sense of perspective as we try to just drive up metrics in relation to a small subset of what schools are about. And it can mean that we end up undervaluing what matters to our collective well-being. So I want to start with that quote in your head and just ask you to think about whether or not there is a read across from what he says about economics, about the market economy, to some of what has been happening across the world in terms of the nature of schooling over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. The context that we are in is one which in my rather long career, there's a level of uncertainty which I have never experienced before in terms of what's going to happen, where we're going to go, what the world's going to be like in the relatively short term, let alone the longer term. The horizon is getting closer and closer, and it's also increasingly blurred, and that relates to every aspect of life. And I want just to very briefly look at some of the factors, some of the areas that are increasing or leading to that uncertainty. And this is all within the last decade that I'm talking about. If we look at the points that are on the screen here, I'd be glad to hear, I'm not going to go through them all, but I'm making a general point about it. The assumptions which have underpinned the way in which countries have related to each other, the way in which trade has taken place across the world, the whole globalization agenda, the nature, remember when the Berlin Wall fell back at 1989, that the Fukuyama then wrote a much misunderstood book, but he talked about the end of history, and what he essentially meant was that liberal democracy was now going to be the norm. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the removal of the way in which the Soviet Union then changed, collapsed, and liberal democracy was perceived to be the norm. And that, for about 20 years, the assumption was that was the world that we were all going to live in. The reality, as we know, partly flowing from the invasion of Ukraine, but the whole globalization agenda, these long supply chains that were there, the assumption that resilience could come from interdependence rather than resilience necessarily residing within an individual economy. All of that has challenged our assumptions, and that has led to huge uncertainty about how things are going to look in this area over the course of the immediate and medium-term future. And that's got enormous implications for our young people in terms of how they are going to make their way in the world economically. How are they going to earn their living? What's the nature of the employment that they are going to have in the future? The whole nature of skill demand is changing very, very dramatically. And ironically, previously the assumption has been that as machines got better, that what that would do would be to replace particular types of manual labour. What's happening now through artificial intelligence is there's a hollowing out of those middle jobs, those jobs in accountancy, those jobs in law, those jobs in administration. Those are the ones that artificial intelligence is replacing. Those have been the backbone of what our young people who've left school and done well at school have gone on to do. So there's a huge challenge in terms of the nature of the way in which our young people will earn their living in the future. A very fluid job market, and the requirement for lifelong learning, genuine lifelong learning, to be able to retrain, readjust as the world changes, will be increasingly important. Another enormous area of uncertainty for our young people in their lives at school and what their future lives are going to be. And if you add to that the kind of changes in society, the kind of changes in how we think about citizenship that have taken place, again, relatively recently. Inequality has been a big theme in the current election campaign. Demography and life expectancy. For the first time, life expectancy is not continuing to extend. In some places, it's actually reducing slightly. But the balance between the young and the old, the intergenerational issues have very much come to the fore. And all of the stuff that's around in relation to fake news, post-truth, alternative facts, all of that added to questioning of democratic values for the first time in many, many, many decades. All of that is another enormous area of uncertainty. And the implications for all of that, for education, are huge. The implication for what we do with our young people during the relatively short time that we have them in our schools are absolutely huge. And if you look down the list of things that I put on the screen, expectations have grown, they continue to grow, but schools are being asked quite rightly to help young people address issues to do with climate change, issues to do with democracy, the nature of knowledge itself, what knowledge counts in an artificially intelligent environment, the nature of where you learn. It's perfectly possible that within this decade, a great deal of what is currently happening inside schools in terms of learning will actually happen elsewhere. The possibility, the instructional role of a school is likely to change quite significantly as artificial intelligence begins to provide young people and their parents and teachers with opportunities for learning, for the way in which the instructional aspect of learning takes place, which will no longer necessitate that happening inside a classroom with 30 pupils and a teacher, particularly as they move into secondary education. So I don't want to over-egg this, but if you look down all of those, there's a huge set of issues for education which are essentially value-driven. They're essentially asking the question, why, what matters, why does it matter, what are the values that underpin the kind of things that we should do inside schools in the face of this uncertainty. And then you add to that the impact of technology and the continuing, as yet slightly unclear impact of the pandemic on the nature of life itself. What we do know is that things are different. What we do know is that things are getting increasingly different. Increasingly, the nature of technology is changing our lives, sometimes without us realizing it. And part of that is about, I don't know whether you can read that or not with the colour, but essentially the point I'm making, I should make a confession, and that is that I'm an unreconstructed history teacher, so I tend to think about issues, set them in the historical context. And what we're seeing is a pace of change which we've never seen before, a pace of change where we just can't even begin to predict what's going to happen in a relatively short period of time. So if we look back, 500 or 600 years, the invention of the printing press over centuries had a major impact on the Renaissance, on the nature of the Reformation and Enlightenment, and on mass education itself. The printing press allowed or enabled much of that to happen, but it happened over a very extended period of time. We then have a series of inventions, the steam engine, powering the Industrial Revolution, electricity coming in the latter part of the 19th century, radio and television, all of that, within about 100 years, transformed the nature of life. But it happened at a pace at which within somebody's lifespan, you can kind of adjust to. It happens, but doesn't happen overnight. And then we look at the period since about 1989-90. And here the pace has quickened so dramatically. Tim Berners-Lee, World Wide Web, 1989 is when it first began to take shape. And then we've got this acceleration: Microsoft, Apple, Yahoo, Google, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, iPhone. It just keeps on going. And that has all led to changes within a horizon of 10 to 15 years. And now, we have artificial intelligence, we have machine learning, we have large language models, we have nanotechnology. Now it's not a decade. Now the changes are taking place within certainly a period of small number of years and sometimes with months. So all of that is meant to make the point about uncertainty and about education and about the importance of values. And it's not something we can dodge. I mean, I sometimes have a great sympathy with, but sometimes people will say, there's too much change. Can they not just let us, stabilize? Let's just, see what we're doing and give us time to do it well. Well, of course, it's important to do things that are going to genuinely bed in. But the nature of the pace of change is going to make it much more difficult for us to try to think about things over an extended horizon. The OECD talked about the small world of the curriculum, the big world of learning. The big world of learning, I mean that in the broadest sense. It talked about students who are the future change agents. Those students are growing up in a digital world. They are growing up with this technology in a way that will allow them to harness and use it in ways that people of my generation certainly can't even begin to cope with. And the competencies which they need to develop during their time at school are important, but the attitudes and values, the way in which they think about themselves, the way in which they think about the world, the kind of things that will drive them, the whys, the things that will lead them to live fulfilling lives, those are the kind of things that we need to think about in education much more deeply. That's where RVE, in its broadest sense, has become center stage, not something that sometimes happens in addition to, the real stuff in terms of literacy and numeracy. RVE is just so important in terms of being at the heart of the curriculum. Too often, we focus on effectiveness without asking whether or not we're getting better and better at doing things that are less and less relevant. And that's where those questions, those why questions, become so important. And the school, over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, has become much more focused on instruction, and that squeezed out a lot of the educational mission of the school. The way in which schools are assessed and measured has focused so much on a subset of what matters. They do matter. I mean, those things are very important. But they shouldn't be allowed to squeeze out the broader educational mission of the school. And that educational mission is driven by those why questions. It's driven by the commitment to thinking about values and what drives us. And that takes us to where we are here in Wales. And I'm not sure that everyone really understands just how big a shift curriculum for Wales was from the previous national curriculum dating back to 1989-90. That difference I talked about earlier, that difference about thinking about a curriculum that builds from purposes rather than worries about starting from content and the organisation of delivery, that starts from purposes, that is revolutionary in terms of the way in which we think about the curriculum. And that's where Wales, I think, has been ahead of the game and is better placed than many countries in order to help our schools, our teachers and our young people to address the levels of uncertainty that we're talking about. And those four purposes, which were consulted on back in 2015-16 across Wales, and which received very, very broad support. When I was doing the work for Successful Futures, the way in which I went about it was partly to look at what's happening, what the research evidence told me, partly looking at what's happening elsewhere in the world, but also to just go around school after school, community after community across Wales and ask a very simple question. Forget all the constraints that are around you just now. We can't do this because. And answer the question, wouldn't it be great if? What would you really like to do for your children if you forget about, if we remove the constraints that say, sorry, Eston won't let me, or the government, the legislation is pointing in this direction. And those 4 purposes grew out of those discussions, as well as what was happening elsewhere in the world. And they're about learning, they're about the nature of learning, they're about value learning, they're about contributing, they're about the way in which young people, as they progress, put themselves in a position to be able to contribute in a whole variety of ways. They're about citizenship in the fullest sense of the word, being ethical, being informed, thinking about these incredibly complex issues that were on the earlier slide in a way that allows you to, as a citizen, to engage with those issues and not just simply be influenced or driven by something that's appeared in social media or something that is in the headlines of the newspaper. And the 4th one is incredibly important. Again, an area that traditionally has been pushed to the side in terms of the mission of the schools, and that's about helping young people to take more control of their own lives, to understand the nature of how relationships are built and developed, to develop the values associated with empathy and so on. So if we look at those, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, the first one about learning is about wanting young people to both value evidence, to ask hard questions, and to have the skills to be able to probe and to get underneath the surface, to be critical thinkers. That's what that first purpose is really about. Sometimes that bit is caricatured as being it's about doing well in A-levels. You know, that's the measure of whether or not we've been successful. It's whether young people do well or whether Wales does well in PISA. It's about much, much, much more than that. It's about the nature of learning as something which gives young people satisfaction, intrinsic satisfaction from the learning process, rather than the extrinsic satisfaction of I have to learn this because there's going to be a test, or I have to learn this in order to get good grades in GCSEs or A-levels. Those matter, of course they matter, but the nature of that purpose is about trying to engender a love of learning. And going back to what I said earlier, those young people are going to have to be lifelong learners. They're going to have to reinvent themselves many times possibly in the course of their lives as the nature of the world round about them changes. The contribution one, again, I don't want to label this, but it's a question that's meant to convey the values that underpin that are about wanting to contribute, thinking about solidarity, thinking about being able to contribute in a way that is not just about how can I influence things, but how can I, how will other people benefit, the last bullet point that's there, and about equity. So contribution, that second purpose embeds lots of values, which are not just about the specific skills to be able to contribute, but actually what it is you are trying to achieve through making that contribution. The next one, in some ways, is the one that at the moment I'm most exercised about. There is a major crisis in the world just now in terms of how our assumptions about the importance of democracy, about the way in which democratic values can be embedded and expressed. And in a world where fake news, where it's extremely difficult to sometimes disentangle those things which are authentic and those things which are inauthentic. In a world where we are seeing autocratic states becoming more confident about the way in which they're going to engage internationally, our young people need to be thinking about all of this, and they need to be understanding what lies behind the democratic values that underpin British society and Western society more generally, and the responsibilities that go with that. And of course in Wales here there's that wonderful word Cynefin, which I think is so important. It's that notion, that sense of place, that citizenship, which actually is about the particular place that you live in and the way in which that becomes part of you as I understand. And that ethical informed citizen purpose is about respect, it's about liberty, it's about responsibility, it's about democratic values in the broadest sense. And lastly, the point I made about earlier about healthy, confident individuals. It's about positive relationships, it's about respect, it's about responsibility, it's about empathy, it's about compassion. And it's bringing that's one of 4 equal purposes. It's not, there's the serious stuff in the curriculum, and then we'll do about health stuff. We'll preach to you about not smoking or not vaping, whatever it might be. This is much, much more fundamental than that as a purpose, as part of the driver for the curriculum for Wales. And the risk is that in any reform, as radical as curriculum for Wales, is that as the reform begins to take shape, that we become focused on specifics, we become focused on a bit of the way in which it's delivered, and that drives out our remembering why we're doing things in the first place, drives out that sense of mission, that sense of purpose, and that's exactly how the educative purpose of the school was reduced to something which is more focused on instruction than on broader education. All of that has huge implications for how we teach. It's huge implications for the nature of what it means to be a teacher. And this is for all teachers, not just teachers who are specifically involved in RVE. This is about all teachers. As a former history teacher, again, there are huge questions about how, when we teach history, how we address value issues in the teaching of history. It's always been there, but it's become even more explicit in the course of the last decade. So what we need, and to succeed in Wales, what we need in order to ensure that the potential of this curriculum for Wales becomes a reality, it needs to remain values and purpose led. And I just can't stress that enough, because in all of my time, good intentions in terms of what we think would be appropriate for young people have got diluted and driven out by the flotsam and jetsam, the battering, the day-to-day issues, which then cause us to lose sight of the fundamentals that lie behind it. So it's values and purpose-led. There is a complex, unpredictable world that we're living in. We have opportunities in terms of interconnectedness that have not been there before, but that means that we've got to use them in order to adapt and change and not just try to hold back the tide. We need both challenge, but we also need humility. We don't know the answers. All we can do is to continue, as I say, with that sense of purpose and those values, to address the issues that are there with a sense of purpose and with being true to the kind of values that drive us as educators in the broadest sense. So, in looking through, there's no shortage of lists of values. I did a quick Google search, and that's a tiny subset of the things that crop up in terms of values, and they're all certainly worthy of understanding and thinking about in the context of school curriculum, the kind of things that our young people should be engaged with. But at the heart of those 4 purposes is character development, is how young people develop as moral beings, as individuals who are going to, we said at the start, they're going to lead, they're going to shape the world that they live in. They're going to shape that world, and what we do in education, we need to think very carefully about what that means. So that character development, ethical living as part of it, so that we give young people the understanding that ethics is not something you study, ethics is something you live. Being an ethical being is not just simply knowing what ethics are and being able to answer questions about it. It's the way in which actually that influences your life. It's about relationships. Running through all of those are about, and particularly in an AI-enabled world, the nature of human contact and human interaction becomes incredibly important. So what we have to be very clear about when we think about artificial intelligence is what is human intelligence, what does it mean to be human in that context, and a lot of that is about relationships. Citizenship runs through it, and that's about how we exercise responsibility for the society in which we live, whatever that might be. And as part of all of that, there's this whole issue, which is very live at the moment, about social cohesion. It's again how we have the kind of society where there are genuinely shared values, and where respect and care for each other becomes a critical part of the way in which schools operate, and the way in which our young people will live their lives. And just to conclude with a quote from Nelson Mandela, which says, much more articulately than I've just done, what all this is about: education is not only about acquiring knowledge, but also about acquiring values that will guide us in life. And I think through those purposes, and through the way in which we think about how they can be put into practice in a whole variety of different ways, Wales, curriculum for Wales, is in as good a position as any other country in order to fulfil the kind of expectation that Nelson Mandela had in that quote. Tanya, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Graham, for that inspirational start to our conference. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions, and we have Libby at the back there with a mic, and she is going to, when she sees a hand go up, she's going to approach you with it. So think about it. Well, what do you want to ask Graham?
Somebody on the corner.
I feel like Annika Rice. Does that make me old? Okay. So my question is, I'm currently doing my doctoral research on...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. What's it?
So I'm currently doing my doctoral research on the curriculum for Wales and implementation. So it's looking at teachers' perceptions of that implementation. So if you were in my shoes collecting data now, what question would you be asking practitioners? Sorry.
The risk is I give you an answer and you fail. I mean, I cannot say more than what I've already said, because I think the key issue about, and I don't like the word implementation. One of the things that I had a debate about with officials in Welsh Government was about the use of words like implementation and delivery, because they suggest that Curriculum for Wales is something which is handed down to you and you just make happen. I prefer the word realisation, because what we want to do is to make those purposes reality in schools. And that will not necessarily mean it's the same in every school. That will not necessarily mean that those purposes take exactly the same form, no matter. And implementation tends to drive you in a kind of not uniform, but certainly a direction where you're looking for high degrees of consistency. Well, consistency is important, but my recommendation was play with the word realisation and try and think about how that's different from implementation. And that goes to the heart of the way in which the Curriculum for Wales was developed, through the pioneer schools. Again, in classic Yes Minister terms, a very brave decision by ministers in Wales. Instead of, as happened not too far away from here, in terms of the decisions about what's in the curriculum being taken centrally and then just passed on, so that's a rollout process, Wales quite deliberately invited the profession to engage in the creation of this new curriculum, building on those purposes. So making a reality is partly about this notion of, the technical term subsidiarity. It's not how do I get you to do things? It's looking upwards from the classroom and saying we only need to interfere sufficiently to try to ensure that there's something characteristic about education in Wales, but that may actually take different forms in different parts of the country. And that word Cynefin, I think, comes into as part of that process. I don't know whether I've answered your question or not, but I wanted to get that off my chest anyway.
Okay. Hi, Professor Donaldson. I just wanted to thank you, first of all, before I ask my question, for your foresight in including religious education as it was then, but religion, values and ethics within the curriculum for Wales. We would not be sat here now having these conversations. We wouldn't be at the heart of the curriculum. And, you know, I'm a bit biased, but I believe the same as you, that RVE is fundamental to achieving the 4 purposes of the curriculum for Wales. So thank you for, you know, putting us where we are now. What I'm finding is there's a little bit of a fear, perhaps amongst some teachers, as the curriculum is rolling out, because we've been so used to having resources and schemes of work and things like that handed to us on a plate, a list of content to tick. And I'm fully with you on the purposes have got to be at the heart of education. So thinking about our tagline, and maybe 2 of the words, because we've always been brilliant at connection, but in terms of creativity and confidence particularly, could you give us some advice on how we support our teachers with their confidence, so that they become confident in the delivery of this curriculum and they embrace their creativity?
Yeah, I think as I said in one of the slides, all of this has huge implications for what it means to be a teacher. That's the reality for all teachers, not just teachers who are directly involved in RVE, but for all teachers. There are huge implications about the nature of a purpose-driven curriculum for the way in which you go about your work. So I think the approach adopted in Wales seems to me is going to have to respond to the anxieties that people have. So there's no point in saying, this is how we do it. You may say we can't do it. It doesn't matter. You're going to have to do it anyway. So I think there has to be a kind of understanding about the way in which this is taking shape, the kind of anxieties which teachers have got, areas where they might need additional support in order to get their heads around it. And the hope would be that, in a few years' time, they won't need that support. The support is a springboard rather than something that then becomes a dependency that you engage on. So I think the way you build confidence partly is by proving you really mean it. And that's a risk, is that, as things get difficult, imperceptibly and sometimes much more directly, suddenly there's a flick of a switch and things change quite dramatically. And teachers say, well, I told you that. It was all, and I knew that was going to happen, so I was right not to bother. So there is something about sustaining this, and that's the big challenge for any major reform, is how you sustain it. And part of that is listening. Part of that is not just assuming that people will just do what so you've given them responsibility, get on with it. So there has to be a culture where there's listening, and there also the way in which Curriculum for Wales originally was developed, that networking, that teacher to teacher, school to school, council to council, that kind of networking needs to continue and be an efforts redoubled to make that a reality. Because the way in which you build confidence is by working with colleagues and seeing other people who are facing the same problem, then together you try to address how to take that forward. If you're isolated in a classroom on your own and you feel helpless, that's when confidence drains away. But it's so important. That's why the strap line for the conference is so important.
Hello, I too am a history and RVE teacher in a secondary setting, and my question really is linking with, as a secondary teacher, we are unfortunately obsessed with GCSE and A-levels and how we as a school will show our pupils are doing really well. And the new curriculum is fantastic, and I'm all for it in the sense that it's producing these very different and creative individuals my concern is how can we, I know the GCSEs are changing, but how can we assess students differently from our current way of working, because it feels or it looks as though the new curriculum is allowing students to express themselves, and then we're then saying to them in year 10, right now you need to conform, we're going to make you go through the traditional form of assessment that we've done for decades, and in a way, it's not taking away from it, but I'm not necessarily getting my point across properly, sorry, but it's you're basically wanting them to be a butterfly, say, in primary stage and then key stage 3, and then you're basically clipping their wings and saying, right, now you need to do this. So I suppose my question is, how do we better assess students off the back of our new curriculum in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, the experience in Scotland in that regard is not a happy one. That the reform that took place in Scotland in the first decade of this century, by the time it worked its way through to qualifications, the qualifications did not reflect the curriculum as directly as it should do. The intention was, I mean, Scottish ministers deliberately said, we're not going to talk about qualification, we're going to build this new curriculum, then we're going to ask the qualifications body to build from the new curriculum. So you had qualifications that grew out, they were curriculum-driven qualifications rather than qualifications driving the curriculum, which has been the case since for as long as I can recall. So the challenge, and in Scotland, we are now involved, and I'm partly involved in this, and it was in discussions earlier last week about this. We're partly involved in trying to rethink the nature of that relationship between the curriculum and qualifications. Part of that is trying to move away from qualifications which are very heavily dominated by exams within a defined period of time, because exams within a defined period of time narrow what it is you assess. Qualifications bodies are driven by reliability. If you want to make things reliable, you reduce what you assess to the things you can reliably assess, and the things you find difficult to reliably assess get driven out. It's a bit like the instruction education point I made earlier. So I think we will move towards much broader forms of assessment, assessment which builds much more directly from the classroom and teachers' direct involvement in that process. But there's a battle to be won there, because there's a credibility issue that needs to be won, and I'm very conscious here in Wales that the challenge is greater here than it is in Scotland, because GCSEs and A-levels have a read across directly to what's happening in England, so that the nature of that relationship makes it Qualifications Wales and the WJEC and so on have a very difficult job to do in order to be true to the new curriculum, but also recognise the way in which qualifications have to be portable and seen to be credible in other jurisdictions. So I don't think this will happen overnight, but I do think that the processes that are in place at the moment will lead to that changing, and the most likely, the pressure, I hope, will come from colleagues in this room and across Wales to say, we want these qualifications to better reflect the purposes that have been driven. I know from my conversations with Qualifications Wales, they get it, but they're in a difficult position, in terms of the pressures that are on them, issues of reliability and expectations that are around. Maybe if we get beyond this election period, things might become a little bit easier. But in this immediate period, it's very hard for people to put their head above the parapet.
Hi. It rolls into that question effectively, and you have answered it in part, I think, but when the sorting hat that universities operate for entry is the A-level, and our A&A stars have fallen from 41% to 34% in a year, our Welsh students aren't going to get to the great institutions to be operators for change. Now, are you suggesting that the universities are willing to change the sorting hat? Because I see no evidence that they're likely to do that.
Yeah, well, there's two things. One, I don't think we should assume that young people who've experienced Curriculum for Wales are in a less good position to do well in GCSE and A-levels. So I don't think that relationship is true. I think we could create a better relationship, but I do think it's still the integrity, because I mean, what's happening in Curriculum for Wales is about higher standards. It is about better learning. I mean, it's not wishy-washy, flim-flam stuff. This is about young people engaging in wanting to engage with complex ideas. And if we do that well, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't go on to do well in GCSEs and A-levels, modified a bit. But I do think in the course of time, that read across from what's happening in the curriculum into GCSEs and A-levels will change. I mean, we do have politicians in this election talking about moving away from current A-levels, for example. I suspect they're moving in a direction that wouldn't fit with what we've just been talking about. But it's on the agenda, you know, for the first time in a long time, the notion that the A-level is a gold standard that you can't change. Well, actually, I think there's now a bit of a debate taking place about the nature of that, and we'll have to see what the next government in the UK does about that, and that may enable things to happen in Wales that at the moment are quite difficult.
Thank you. We've now come to the end of time for questions. So let us just give another round of applause to Professor Donaldson. Thank you so much.